Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at what happens now that the United States is formed. First of all, there's four primary ideals of the Declaration of Independence: equality, the unalienable rights, the consent of the governed, and the right to alter or abolish government. However, just because you have put these things out here as the foundations of government doesn't mean that's what actually exists in society, because this is what you want to build towards. Now you got to create the government structures to actually, create the society that guarantees these things. How do you do that is going to be kind of complicated, okay? Because ultimately, we have to ask ourselves an essential question: who gets the pals? Who gets the power? Who gets the authority? How do you maintain legitimacy? And how do you maintain sovereignty? Who gets to do these things? And one of the first questions that the founders really ask is, should it be the state or federal government that has the majority of these powers? And when we mean federal government, we mean national government or US government. Because remember that all 50 states actually have power. And in how much, though, is the question that these founders are actually questioning. How much should the national government, the federal government, have versus the state governments? And you still see this today. A lot of this is like, how much, power should the state have to decide what it wants to do versus the national government saying, well, you have to do these things. It is so, the argument you see today started basically as soon as the country was formed. They were having these debates. And understand, the United States is in a different kind of state after the American Revolution. So the revolution happens, the Declaration of Independence calls us a country. We need to decide on a type of government we want. And what it comes down to is a representative democracy, aka a republic. So the government authority comes from the people who elect officials. All right. Now the Constitution says we're going to have a representative democracy, and the people are going to elect those officials. Those officials are going to have power. Okay. This is not unusual because a lot of the 13 colonies, when their legislatures, when their legislative branches were done before we became the United States, and when the English were off doing their own thing, they would usually elect people to make the laws of each different colony, Massachusetts or Vermont or Virginia or Georgia. So they just took that and they brought that to, okay, this is what we're going to do as US government. You have to have people that are going to be elected to create laws, because people in general don't care about governing. They just want a good, stable society. The problem is that this country had some issues. Number one is, if you're going to say that all men are created equal, what do you do about this? Because post the American Revolution, you had the old, the southern states that still practice slavery, and then you had the northern states that, by the time the American Revolution is over, you have places like Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. They all had already, by the time the revolution's over, abolished slavery. New York and Pennsylvania were in the middle of abolishing slavery. The new territories out west were starting to abolish slavery, but the South did not want to do that. And so, what do you do about the fact that you have the Mason-Dixon line? This is the line where the slave states began and the free states ended. What do we do about this? Because if all men are created equal, then you have a collection of individuals that are being enslaved because of the color of their skin, and that kind of goes against the Constitution. Okay. Number two, what do you do about debt? The United States government owed people money who funded the war against the British. Okay, you had foreign debt to other countries, you had state debt to the different states, and then you had overall federal domestic debt. Okay, so we owed France and Spain, who helped us to defeat the British. We also owed money to citizens that actually loaned their money to help fight in the war. And then finally, the US government owed money to soldiers who actually fought the war. And you want to pay off your soldiers, because if you don't pay off your soldiers, they'll take up arms and they'll basically overthrow you. That's part of how coups actually happen, is that people in government don't pay their soldiers, they turn around and take over the state. And the entire debt load was about $80 million, which would equal basically $2.4 trillion in modern day money. So the United States had a lot of debt. And how do you go about dealing with those things? And then finally, we've got to remember that this was the USA basically right here. You still had the Spanish that were out there. You still had the British up in Canada. You still had the French controlled some areas, and you had contested, other countries. So you needed to make sure that you maintained sovereignty, so these other countries didn't take you over, and there was a desire to see how far they could go this direction out west, even though there were obviously indigenous and it was claimed by other countries that were colonial powers. Now, eventually, the question of who has government powers needs to be dealt with three different forms of power distribution. You either have what's called a unitary government. This is where all the power basically comes from the national government. So, under a unitary style government, power would emit from only the national government, like the US government. Or you can have not only a unitary government, but a federal government. And a federal government meant that power is actually shared between national, which is your federal government, and state governments. And the third form of government would not only be unitary or federal, but you could have a confederate government where the national government is super weak and most of the power actually goes to the state governments. The national government doesn't have a lot of say, and the states are basically, it's kind of like a loose alliance, less of regular government. So you had these different forms of power distributions from governments, and the founders needed to decide, okay, what are we going to do? And what they decided is create the first Constitution of the United States, which was known as the Articles of Confederation. It was written basically at the end of the Revolutionary War, and it was based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The big thing is you do not want a king, you do not want a leader up top that has the potential of being oppressive to you. So you needed to, these founders decided, okay, so what are we going to do? What type of power distribution? Who's going to get the power within government? And the name should give it away. Articles of Confederation. Who's going to have the majority of power here? Okay. Well, a Confederate style government. So each state is going to be independent, essentially. Okay. The national government, the US government, is going to be very weak. And it's going to mean it has very little power to actually solve the problems of the United States. And the states actually held a lot more power than the US government. What would happen is if there was a time of crisis, all these states would unite together and fight against whatever that problem was. Okay. Here was the structure of government. You only had one branch, and that was Congress. So we had representatives of the people that would make laws. No executive branch. There was no president. There's no judicial branch. There's no Supreme Court. And there was basically to pass laws, you had one vote per state to actually pass laws. Okay. The power of Congress was they could make war, they build armies and navies, and you would settle disputes amongst states. So when states got into it with each other, Congress would step in and say, okay, everybody chill, everybody calm down. And the states would obey Congress. The states would send troops when requested by Congress. So each state essentially had its own army. The states regulate their own trade and actually can tax each other, and every state had their own currency. So basically, you have 13 different countries that will get together on occasion to fight against the bad guys. Okay. Now, if you wanted to change the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states would have to agree, and the representatives would rarely show up because it really didn't matter. Not a whole lot would get done. And Congress couldn't tax. Therefore, you couldn't really raise a US army because you weren't getting any money to do that. So every state would basically create their own military. And there's no executive out there to enforce the law anyway. So what are we doing here? Okay? And there's no judicial branch to settle disputes between states. So it can't enforce its own law. There's no mechanism of interpreting the law. And so the major problem is if you can't tax, you can't regulate trade, you can't enforce laws, then you don't have much of a national government to solve problems. And the Articles of Confederation, this is why you don't have it today. And the end result is, you might have feared a monarchy, but now you've created the situation where all these states, there's no unification. We're not really United States of America. We're just kind of 13 independent states that want to do our own thing, and we're hoping that we get along with each other. So basically, about 20% of the power of government went to the US government, to Congress. 80% of the governmental powers were to the states. So, by the time we get to about 1781, the end of the American Revolution, it wasn't working out really well. Fast forward to 1787, Shays' Rebellion. Basically, Daniel Shays leads a small revolution of farmers. There's a bunch of farmers. It's bad economic times. There's high taxes. A lot of people are in debt. They're foreclosing their homes, and so he gets a group of farmers together and they start to fight in a rebellion against the state of Massachusetts, attempting to overthrow the Massachusetts government. So there's battles between the government of Massachusetts, but they can't actually put down the rebellion. They say, well, the US government needs to come and help us. And the government's just like, well, we don't have any money. We don't have really a US military. Okay. And eventually you actually have, the state of Massachusetts has to hire private militias to come down and put down this rebellion of farmers. And what they come down to realize, the Articles of Confederation are too weak. The current government is too weak. It's creating a fear of anarchy. It's allowing people to get into the little factions and create violence. And eventually, what happens is the founding fathers come together and say, look, we got to create a new constitution. We got to hold a constitutional convention, and we got to create a stronger sense of government. How do we do that? We create the modern constitution.